Terry, thank you very much indeed. At the end of this presentation, ladies and gentlemen, you will have 15 seconds to ask questions. What you don't know is that I will be asking you questions as well, and that there will be fabulous prizes provided at the course at the expense of Pete Marwick Mclintock. Guinness's bid for distillers, Blue Arrow's bid for manpower, Michael Knighton's bid for Manchester United, a company I once bought called Davies Dowson. What have they all in common? You, sir, right at the back, next to Keith White, right at the back there, what have they in common? I can't hear. I can't hear. Next to Keith White, what have they in common? That's absolutely right, absolutely right. I'll call upon my assistant to give that man a prize. This is no ordinary football. It is a Michael Knighton memorial football. It's unautographed, as you'll see, and it's therefore of greater value. If you don't believe me that most acquisitions fail, ask for proof at the end of this presentation. Guinness, that their management failed in their bid for distillers because two promises which they made in the offer document were not kept: to move the corporate headquarters to Scotland and to appoint Sir Thomas Risk as chairman. The management failed, obviously for other reasons, which are presently sub judice. Blue Arrow's bid for manpower failed because of timing. The synergy was excellent, but the stock market collapsed. There were probably other reasons, not unassociated with a loan of £25 million. Michael Knighton's bid for Manchester United failed, not because he wasn't that committed to the club. Also, he hadn't got the finance arranged. My acquisition of Davies Dowson failed, not for any of the reasons listed above. It was an excellent little company, but the management just did not want to be acquired. Guinness's bid for distillers and Blue Arrow's bid for manpower, they were not misconceived, but they were mishandled. Michael Knighton's bid for Manchester United was misconceived. He wasn't a great fan of the club, and he hadn't got the money to pay. It was also mishandled. He should have anticipated the high public profile he would have received from the acquisition. He also should have anticipated that his finances on the Isle of Man would have been probed by newspapers. This is Doel's first law of acquisition. You must remember this. You can do everything right and still fail. There are three corollaries to this first law. In the words of Obi-Wan Kenobi, if the Force is not with you, forget it. The market was against Blue Arrow. The second corollary to the first law is, if in doubt, do nought. The third corollary, it is better not to make an acquisition than to make a bad one. And we've all seen this week, the second and third corollary, with Meggitt pulling their bid for United Scientific Holdings. So acquisition is not just a process, it is a praxis. You need a combination of good luck or magic. All you can hope to do through hard work and imaginative work is to minimize that element of good luck. Like all things in life, you have to have a serious approach. You have to approach serious projects with a mixture of humility and confidence. Humility in that you must try and keep an open mind and listen and learn. Confidence in that you must have the ability to back your own judgment, because at the end of the day, advisors advise and you decide, as someone else said quite recently. Who is making the acquisition? It isn't a company. It isn't a firm of solicitors. It's you. You must be clear about your own motives. One of the worst acquisitions I ever made was when I bought a newspaper. Why? Because I love newspapers. The thing lost money before I bought it, it lost money while I owned it, and it lost money until I closed it. Why? Because I bought it because I love newspapers, not as a business. I wasn't clear about my own motives. How many of you in the audience have hobbies? The gentleman 3 rows back there, the one in the glasses, 3 rows back. Tell me, what is your hobby? Yes? Yes, you in the expensive suit. Yeah? Photography. Let me give you some advice. Do not buy a business in that field. But we'll give you a prize in any case. Just as you have to understand your psychology, so you have to understand your colleagues and your advisors, as well as the vendor and his or her advisors. You know, I don't know whether making an acquisition is an art or a science. You will all know someone who intuitively and instinctively spots a bargain and buys it. You'll all know someone who pores over books, does a lot of research, and approaches the subject scientifically. Both approaches are valid, and the best is probably a mixture of the two. One thing you should always bear in mind when making an acquisition is that you're not just making a financial investment, you're also making an emotional investment. And the vendor is making an emotional divestment. Acquisitions cost money, whether you succeed or fail, because they take your time. They take your advisor's time. People such as Mclintock, I know their fees are very modest. Nevertheless, they have to be paid after a reasonable period of credit. Never underestimate your own emotional investment. You decide you want to make an acquisition, and even though the information you have tells you that you mustn't proceed, you go ahead rather than make a fool of yourself. Why? Emotional investment. You've all seen it, and we've all probably done it. Remember the second corollary. If in doubt, do not. One interesting point for those of you who are in PLCs, you'll notice what I call the second best syndrome. How many times do you see someone build up a stake in a public company? And because they're the first to build the stake, the immediate reaction of the incumbent management, it's almost a knee-jerk, is to oppose those who are first in. And what do? Whoever comes along second is embraced, whether they're a white knight or a shabby knight. If you're looking at acquiring a public company, don't always get in there first. Remember, sometimes it's best to be second. The best illustration of this recently is Hanson's bid for Goldfields, that Menorca were in there first and their first bid failed. You'll notice this time and time again, that this is amazing recurrence in the psychology of takeover. This is my credo. Madam, the lady over there, the second row back, do you really think I'm 28? I can't hear. I'm sorry. Do you really think I'm 28? Yes, she thinks I'm 28. We've got a fabulous prize for you here. Thank you very much. If she's got a business card, could you take it with her? That's good. Thank you. Remember this little credo and the third corollary. It is better not to make an acquisition than to make a bad one. And I can tell you this from experience. All this is all on this slide. It's all standard textbook stuff, and that without demeaning other speakers, that they will cover it. As you gathered, I'm not going to speak to you about the technical stuff. With respect, this is for the accountants, the lawyers, and the merchant bankers. First of all, you must have a clear strategy about where you're taking your existing business, or the kind of business you want to get into. If your strategy isn't clear, your acquisitions won't be clear either, and because of that they probably won't work. So before you even contemplate making an acquisition, seriously ask yourself whether you could grow organically through market or product development. Do examine the strategic alternatives. After all, why buy if you can grow? It seems to me that the major reason for acquiring is to reduce the growth timescale. Once you have decided that you can't grow and that the best route for you is to buy, then the quality of your acquisition will depend on the quality of your strategy and research. Get your criteria right so that you don't waste too much time looking at hares that aren't going to run. My own kill rate in this respect is probably no more than 1 in 7. The next element is obviously availability. Here Doel's second law obtains: patience. My colleagues and I at Triplex Lloyd, we identified a company in 1983, and the probability is that we may acquire it in 1990 or see it go out of business this week. It is a long time, but we've been doing other things, and it simply has not been available. Again, back to Manchester United. Unless you've got the finance in place, unless you've got your criteria clear, then you're not in the business of acquiring. You're merely window shopping. Throughout this presentation, on most of the slides that you'll see the word people. Again, companies don't buy and companies don't sell. It's people. You have to have a person or a team you can rely on, not just to research and negotiate an acquisition, but to integrate it and to manage it. You have to develop a relationship with a vendor and their advisors. The more positive and helpful the relationship, the more information you will get. The more accurate your judgment will be on the acquisition, and the better it will be. Foreplay. Terry? Terry, do you know what this means? We can't hear you. We can't hear you. Terry, do you know what this means? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. What does this mean?
It seemed like a good idea inviting you back in last February.
I've got a special prize for you. I think you really know what it means. I think you've had enough prizes, actually. It's a turkey. This is Doel's third. I'm glad that Terry came up then. This is Doel's third law. Good advice is never expensive. Before I can see the senior partner of Pinson's at the back, and he's scribbling this down. Select your advisors carefully and wisely. You know, I can remember making an acquisition of a company, and at 3 in the morning, the solicitor acting for us, he wasn't my choice, but one I inherited. He took me outside and he said to me, I don't think you should go ahead with this. You know, I reckon if I'd asked him whether I should cross from one side of the road to the other, he would have warned me against it. I ignored his advice and we made the acquisition, and it was a great success. But I lowered his fee as a result, and we never used him again. So pick good commercial people. Just a point on accountants, as there's a surfeit of them here today. Auditors are not the best people to advise on acquisitions. They will count and tell you how many cans of beans are on the shelf. They won't always tell you if the beans are past the sell-by date. You cannot expect to be an expert in every field of acquisition. The code, financial engineering, contracts, we've heard pensions just earlier. Employ the best advisors, solicitors, accountants, actuaries, and merchant bankers, and preferably in that order. Whether you're buying a private or a public company, you must have an anchor point. The best anchor point is always the last audited accounts. I'm sad to say you cannot rely 100% on audited accounts. As those of you who may be shareholders in Cray Electronics or Dominion International or one or two other companies may know. There again, you have to look not just to the reputation of the auditors, but the competence of the partners to ascribe a confidence level to the value of the audited accounts. At Triplex Lloyd, we use Pete's Birmingham because we know and we trust the partners there. Obviously, the more recently audited accounts, the better. But remember, you must test their validity and accuracy in as many ways as you can. That's not just poring over the figures with a calculator, it's visiting the businesses and getting a gut feel. There's so much information on companies in the public domain. I call this white information. You can get it off customers, you can get it off suppliers, members of staff, as well as from poring over the accounts. Due diligence. Your due diligence should not just focus on checking facts. Ask yourself, does the business look right? How do you feel about it? What are the people like that you're dealing with? Speak with the customers, the suppliers, where you can, ex-employees. Never, ever rely on consultants completely for your due diligence. At the end of the day, it's you and your colleagues. It's your judgment and your decision. This is the corollary to Doel's second law, patience. Beware acquisitions which have to be done in a hurry. Always try and dictate the timescale and the program from the outset. If the business is that good and the profits are improving, why should the owner want to sell out so quickly? Unless, of course, Niagara's round the bend. So always try and dictate the timescale. The best way to do this is to draft a letter of intent, making it crystal clear your interest in the business and the areas you wish to investigate and the information you want. Any good commercial solicitor will draft you such a letter. But remember, it's always subject to contract. Again, we come back to people. If the person who is selling you the business, if they like you, or even if they don't, spend time with him or her, and they will tell you all about it. The best question to ask is, tell me, Mr. Blank or Mrs. Blank, how did you come to be in this business? And then you implement Doel's fourth law. You shut up and you listen. You negotiate again, not with an institution, not with a vendor, not with solicitors, but with people. Except, of course, if you're buying a business from a receiver. Remember what Duddy Kravitz said, it may be a bent crap game, but it's the only game in town. Who played Duddy Kravitz? Does anyone know? Who played Duddy Kravitz in the film? That's a planted... I recognize that voice. You can have one of the balls provided by Pete Marwick Mclintock. No own goals though, Richard. Judge the people you're negotiating with at the outset. If you don't believe that they're being straightforward with the information they've provided you, then you can bet that they're not going to be straightforward in the negotiations. If you have to negotiate with difficult people, you must plan your negotiating strategy well in advance. And remember, if it is a bent crap game, then Duddy Kravitz, he was probably wrong. There will be other games in town, or patience will bring its own reward. I'm sure you all know how to roll the pitch. If the vendor likes golf, you send along one of your colleagues who plays golf, because you haven't got the time to play golf. Or you talk golf. If your vendor is close to retirement, you don't send along a whiz kid. You send along someone who will empathize with the vendor. You roll the pitch. You also set out the conditions on which you're prepared to pay the price. The price you put in your letter of intent will 99 times out of 100 not be the price you pay. Why? For one simple reason. The vendors will have misled you about the quality of the business they are selling. Why? Because they want the best possible price. The objective of your acquisition strategy is crystal clear. You want to buy the business at the lowest possible price. When you have the pitch rolled, you set out your price and your condition. This is Doel's fifth law. It's a very important law. This is what I call the hinge law. At some point during the negotiation, when you're speaking with a vendor, you look the vendor straight in the face and you say, if the business is as remarkable and as good as you say, we shall pay the price you are asking. The corollary of this law is, of course, the business will rarely be as remarkable and as wonderful as the vendor would have you believe, which is why you should not be prepared to pay the initial asking price. If it is as wonderful as the vendor says, then the benefit should be for your account. Have you ever thought who marketed the Venus de Milo? It's wonderful. There is this statue with two arms missing. And yet it's priceless, absolutely priceless. Every vendor will tell you his or her business is the Venus de Milo. There may be two arms missing, but it's priceless. The sixth law is this: prepare to lose. And the corollary of this is minimize and protect your downside. Let the vendor see, and again, this is part of the psychology, that while you're keen on the business, you're not desperate. 9 times out of 10, you'll be up against competition. If a merchant bank is acting for the vendor, and it's a Birmingham merchant bank, you can bet it'll be marketed to 40 people already. Resist synthetic pressures from the vendors to make you compete with the competition. Remember to say no to Dutch auctions. Just reverse your thinking. Suppose you're selling a business and the potential buyer comes along to you and says, I must have this business. It's absolutely vital for the development of my existing business. Your immediate reaction would be, can I take the number I first thought of and double it? It's a fine line, very fine line. You mustn't act as if you couldn't care less. But on the other hand, you must be prepared to lose, and you must communicate this fact or feeling to the vendor. For a major acquisition, you need a team. For a small acquisition, if you're a small businessman, you need at least a couple of colleagues or you need help. The players again, the people, the vendors and advisors, get to know them, get to understand their idiosyncrasies. If you're making an acquisition, prepare for a tiger shoot. You must take along the right people. This is my best team up here. The nose or the tire kicker. You must know someone like that, someone who you can ask to go along and kick the tires on the acquisition and say to you, it looks like it may be worth this. The guy with the nose, or the woman with the nose, who says, that's good, or this doesn't feel right. Take advice, particularly take advice on how the business looks and how it feels to the people whose opinion you value. The best nosers and best tire kickers, they'll give you a ballpark price. They will tend to give you a different perspective to your professional advisors, to your investigating accountants. They'll also give you, key to value, the upside and the downside. Do you know, one of the most serious mistakes I made in my professional career was I employed a nose. And what I didn't appreciate was that he was such a good nose that the only way he could keep his beak sharp was to act as a free-range chicken. Colleagues used to complain, oh, he comes in late, he's part-time, he seems to spend a lot of time talking to people and not doing much. Do you know, they were wrong. The reason he was a great nose was that he did talk to people, but more important, he listened. but you couldn't put him in the corporate box, that there wasn't an elegant place for him in the structure. Lo and behold, we made an acquisition, and it was a minor disaster. And many months later, I met the nose, and before I mentioned this acquisition, he asked me, he said, "Did you buy Company X?" And I told him, as a matter of fact, we did. And he said, "Well, I told so-and-so in your organisation not to buy it, because the sales manager was unreliable, and he'd already set up in competition on the side." And I sat there absolutely gobsmacked until I was able to say, "Did you really?" I asked you to ask yourself, there was this man, he cost us with his car and everything, 40 to 50k per annum. And we wasted probably several hundred thousands of pounds just because he didn't quite fit into the corporate structure. The best nosers are wheeler dealers. They're traders. More often than not, they won't be able to write you a decent report, an acquisition profile, because they probably can't read or write. What they do know is how to sniff out a good acquisition from a bad one. And the other thing is, they just cannot resist sticking their noses in it. So that you'll be able to get a nose to look at a business for you for quite a small fee, and often just for love, sometimes just for love. As you can see, I've got a reasonable nose, but one that, I'm sorry for the lady in the second row back there, unfortunately it's been broken in a couple of places. But I think my particular forte is as a poker player. To negotiate an acquisition, you need to be able to play poker. You have to know when to quit, when to raise the stakes, and when to call the other side's bluff. You have to be prepared to lose, and you have to limit your downside. If you're not prepared to play poker, you shouldn't be in the acquisition business. I must confess to you that I am not, and one or two of my colleagues in the audience know this, I am not a very good negotiator. You will be absolutely appalled at the small fee I'm receiving for this presentation. It is the task of the negotiator and the nitpicker to improve upon the stakes that the poker player has committed. A nitpicker, we know them all, don't we? A nitpicker will try and win every point of detail. You know, has the holiday pay been accrued? The number of working days in this month is different to last month. And therefore, if you leave the nitpicker in charge of negotiations, it's doomed to failure. He'll nitpick to such an extent that it will drive the vendors either to threaten to strangle him or her, or to at least want to up stumps and literally terminate the negotiations. That's not necessarily a bad thing. A truly outstanding nitpicker will normally ensure that negotiations go on to the wee small hours of the morning. And in desperation, the vendors will appeal to the negotiator to be reasonable. That's just what you want. It's therefore vital that the negotiator has the authority to overrule the nitpicker. Excellent negotiators, by definition, have an innate ability of timing, knowing when to press a point and when to concede. Good negotiators who wish to win 3 points will always argue on 7. They'll concede on 4 and therefore appear reasonable to the vendors so that they're able to stick on 3. In major transactions, particularly PLCs, there are always a whole host of loose ends relating to litigation, contracts, freeholds, pensions, you've heard. Does the boundary run this way or that way? The larger and more complex the transaction, the greater the need for what I call a rear gunner. Sometimes this task falls to the nitpicker, but if it's a complex negotiation and you wish to keep pressure on the vendors, it's far better to have a rear gunner who's not continuously present at the negotiation, but who comes in and out on specific points. This can be a great help. This brings a certain freshness and a new perspective to the transaction. Sometimes it's a positive reinforcement, but other times you can use it as a spoiler or to stir things up. Remember, and this is very important, that each negotiation develops a life and a momentum of its own. The longer it goes on, the more the people directly involved, the more they focus on the objective of completing the acquisition. That's their goal. The poker player, to be effective, has to distance himself or herself, because only he or she can determine whether the balance of the negotiation has been properly struck and its validity and value achieved. The poker player should be in the best position to make that judgment. Of course, any wise vendor will be fielding their own team, and their poker player will call the shots. Their negotiator and nitpicker, they'll play the usual Mutt and Jeff act to soften you up. So do beware. Deceptive bets. Away day lawyers, those are people from out in the sticks, are usually out of their depth. You must beware of these. They've normally got to get back to the country for a dinner, or they're intimidated or frightened that they may have put themselves or their clients at risk. Far better to deal with a vendor who has a reputable firm of solicitors, who sold businesses before. Otherwise, you'll find you're negotiating with two people, the vendor and the solicitor, and you'll find it's like educating archery. If there's one thing worse than an away day solicitor, it's an in-house solicitor. Their principal motive is fear. Fear of making a mistake. They know that if things go wrong commercially with a transaction, that quite unfairly, they will carry the can. Someone said, you choose your friends, but not your relatives. Most acquisitions where relatives have been involved, in my experience, tend to be fractious. Relatives tend to loathe one another and resent the compensation or the price being paid to another member of the family. So if Uncle Charlie only speaks for 30%, his relatives will want him to get under 10% of the proceeds. Pride and joy. Most people who've built up their companies, and they're successful, which is why you want to buy them, they've made an enormous emotional investment in them. They're their pride and joy. You may say, well, once we've acquired the business, Grandad, we're going to cut out the gas mantle line. But if Grandad laid down the gas mantle line in 1927, even though it's never made a bean since 1935, you are kicking him in his pride and joy. And during the acquisition, he will kick you back. The poison pawn. You know hundreds of examples of these. How many companies do you go to buy where the freehold of the building is owned by the vendor personally or his auntie? Or we have a special arrangement on that particular piece of equipment. Or Tom, Dick and Harry. They're a sprightly 63, and although their 5-year service agreements may look mink-lined, it is in fact ermine on closer inspection. And they're each entitled to a state coach with an orb and a scepter. Never buy a business on the strength of an accountant's report. Accountant's reports, you may say this is heresy, this is absolutely true. Accountant's reports are always excellent background material, but they will be so heavily qualified that you'll have very little chance of comeback. They cannot possibly know the true value to you of the business you're acquiring, because after all, they are not running your business, you are. If you accept a contract drafted by the vendor, it'll be as transparent as a gin and tonic. You'll see the phrase, best knowledge and belief. This warranty will apply to stock, work in progress, debtors, creditors, the kitchen sink. Freely translated, best knowledge and belief means a definite maybe. I'll tell you what these warranties are worth. You probably feel like doing this. Close your eyes. All of you, close your eyes. What do you see? I know you want to keep them shut, but do you mind reopening them? Your defense against meaningless warranties is Doel's fifth law. Remember, if the business is as remarkable and as good as you say, we shall pay the price you're asking. And then you say to the vendor, I'm sure you'll have no objection to warranting what is a remarkable and excellent business. And shut up. The first one to speak is out. Confusion over warranties will lead you to debates at 3 a.m. on the meaning of words. If you are involved in these discussions, it's because you've hired the wrong lawyer. The area of warranties is a really complex minefield. You have to use your common sense. You have to have the good commercial lawyer to translate your common sense and commercial judgment into the warranties you want. And remember, you must stick to your guns over whichever components of the transactions you feel are vital. And don't concede to having them watered down with phrases like best knowledge and belief. For at the end of the day, if the acquisition fails, and 4 years out that you're in court, the strength of your case against the vendor will be a function of the strength of the warranties you obtained in the sale and purchase agreement. In essence, all an acquisition is a transaction between the buyer and seller. Consideration is exchanged for value. So if you are paying good money, then you want good value. Due diligence, strong warranties, an excellent commercial lawyer, good investigating accountants, they are actually your best guarantee. Throughout this presentation, you've seen the emphasis on the importance of people. I want you to put all that out of your mind when dealing with receivers. If you can empathize with a receiver, there's a job for you at the Dudley Zoo Reptile House. Seriously, there are some good receivers and there are some snakes. The best receivers, they'll do all they can to preserve the business, while of course securing the best price for whoever's recommended their appointment. It's usually the banks. The bad news when dealing with receivers is that they know the price of everything and the value of nothing. They will impose very tight deadlines on you because their primary task is to move quickly, to restructure the business, to hive it down into a company and sell it out. They're past masters at the Dutch auction and playing one party off against the other. And they do it with remarkable ruthlessness. The good news is that if you acquire a business from one of the better receivers, you will buy a business in 100% pristine condition, clean and with no dead bats in the belfry. You all know what dress crab is. You see a business, the owner wants to retire. For the last 4 years, the business has made £250,000. The year you're buying it, it's going to make 750,000. Since 1945, the owners come in at 3 a.m., polished the floors, counted the paper clips, and dusted the light bulbs. There is absolutely no way you can improve upon the performance of this business. More important, you don't know whether the £750,000 profit forecast for the current year is genuine. It could have been made in 1957, 1967, or 1977. Because remember, a private owner runs a company primarily for cash, not for profit. He or she, they run it to minimize their tax bill. This is what I call dress crab. There's only one way for a business like that to move, and that is sideways. And after 3 months, you'll find, like dress crab, it stinks. There you are. You purchase a company, all is sweetness and light, and you've handed over the vendor a check for 2, 20, or 50 million. And you're counting on their services for the next 3 months or the next 3 years. The vendor says, it won't change my life. Do you know that in 60% of the cases it will? But what is even more remarkable is that in 40% of the cases, it is in my experience, it won't. And here is where you have to make a very important judgment. Does the man or woman who's selling the business, are they in it just for the lolly, or do they love it? Because you can have the best of both worlds. We've acquired businesses at Triplex Lloyd and retained the owners. And you know, in spite of substantial sums paid to them as consideration, the owners have remained and worked as hard as they did before the acquisition. But you must be very careful and you must be very discerning. Above all, from start to finish, avoid being patronizing and arrogant. For in 40% of the cases, If you handle the vendor carefully, you can have, as I say, the best of both worlds. Beware dead bats in the belfry. Litigation and product SSAP 24, rent reviews, approach all those with caution. I used to work for a company called LMI, who had a product called WD-40. I don't know whether any of you know that. The company, I don't know whether you've heard of the product, have you? WD-40. You have, yeah. Okay. It's no prize. Your car works, doesn't it? The company made £1 million on 5 million. And shortly before LMI were taken over, the license lapsed, so that the company couldn't produce the product. So the acquirer bought a company with no product. What you must check is what I call IC, which is intensive care. You must examine closely the product and the service to see whether it's heading for obsolescence or not. The number of times people get caught on that is immense. People often ask me what I do for a living, and I'm very prone to answer. I'm paid to ask the dumb question. The reason the dumb question is the dumb question is because people tend not to ask it. This is my 7th law. Do not be afraid to ask the dumb question. I know some people would rather die than make fools of themselves. Don't be afraid to make a fool of yourself. On the next 3 slides, here are some dumb questions you should ask. This is a commercial on behalf of Pete, Mark, Mclintock and myself. For a small fee up there, we will give you the answers. That's my fee, that theirs is probably in a different ballpark. These questions, the answers to them, they'll save you money. Okay? You have to plan to integrate the business. Although the benefits of acquisition and integration, they take a long time to flow. Unless you structurally integrate a business rapidly, then you will lose much of the benefits you were initially aiming for. My recommendation to you is to have a 13-week plan. So at the end of that period, you can say to the corporate, that the corporate management and reporting structure is settled and that you've made the key changes. Then let the operating management, let them get on with it to bring in the long-term benefits. Of course, you need some flexibility in planning. While your mind should be made up about the direction you wish the business to take, you may find that there are hidden treasures that you didn't realize existed when you carried out your due diligence. The most common form of hidden treasure is people. You've heard the phrase, they're a prophet in their own country. And because they are, no one takes any notice of them. So often that it happens that in a time of upheaval, the good people who've gone unnoticed, that they come to the fore. Other hidden treasures tend to flow from the benefits of rationalization. You're able to concentrate the business from 2 sites onto 1. You're able to rationalize a product line, increase utilization of plant. It's a poor acquisition if there's no hidden treasure. By definition, hidden treasure is for your account. The most classic case in recent times was Martin Sorrell in his bid. Does anyone remember the company? Martin Sorrell's bid. Anyone remember the company? Sorry? No, it was the one after that, was an advertising agency. That's the one, WPP was the one he started with. Absolutely right. But he found, when he got in there, that they owned the freehold of a building in downtown Tokyo worth 830 million. That's real hidden treasure. It's like a galleon, isn't it? You have to consider the impact also that the acquisition will have upon your own organization. This is what I call the jigsaw effect. If you conceive of your company as a jigsaw with all the pieces in place or not in place, directly you add another piece or several other pieces, the whole pattern of the jigsaw changes. So you've got to give very careful consideration to where you put the pieces in. To all integration, there's a cost. You should cost your plan and make sure that you derive the benefits that flow from it. Otherwise, in the words of Ernest Saunders or Tony Berry, you could well snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And of course, the people. You know the saying, the better the devil you know. You may think as the acquirer that, like me, you're charismatic, sweet, a wonderful person. But to those people who've just been sold, and that's how many people regard themselves as victims of acquisition, you represent uncertainty, anxiety, and at the worst, a threat to their livelihoods. Never underestimate the need to win hearts and minds. I must confess, one of the worst acquisitions I ever made, it was entirely my own fault. Fortunately, it was a small one, but my mistake was I didn't go out of my way to reassure the management that they were okay once we'd taken them over. I never seemed to win their confidence. And as a result, the acquisition was a failure. You will see examples of this every day. And in point of fact, I mentioned a company that we at Triplex Lloyd, we've been tracking since 1983. And that is just one case where it's been taken over by a public company and they've ruined it, basically. Communications, that's been stressed this morning. You know this. You have to communicate to all the stakeholders in your business. In any case, you should want to. This is one of those acid tests, is if the acquisition is as good as you feel and the numbers stack up, you must have a good story to tell, and you should want to tell it. You have to tell it if you're a PLC. Depending on the scale of the acquisition, how good your commercial lawyer or company secretary is, they'll advise you on the yellow book implications and the class of circular required. You have to tell the press. You should want to tell the press the good news. You should want to tell the analysts the good news, whether they'll interpret it as good news or not. These days, I'm not sure. So draft your press releases with care and anticipate awkward questions. Another very important point, you should inform your bankers if you're acquiring a business with any debt or even if there's no debt there, because naturally they'll want to know what the impact is on your borrowings and your gearing, whether it's positive or negative. Presumably, also you'll want to create a buzz in the marketplace. This is good news you want to tell your customers. More business for your suppliers. You're acquiring to grow. Tell the customers the good news and also the suppliers. You'll also want to communicate with your existing management and your new staff and management. Explain the benefits to them, not just bland statement about we are an equal opportunities employer, but by the acquisition, your jobs are secure, your career prospects are better. And don't just say it, clearly demonstrate it. Make promotions. You know, no business operates in a vacuum. You operate in a community. And you have to explain your acquisition in order that you get the appropriate feedback. You've heard Norman Fowler talk this morning about skill shortages. You have to project yourself as a good employer. It makes recruitment and obtaining services so much better. Next slide, the international dimension. This could be a day's conference in itself. All your attention should be drawn to what I call the Greg Louganis factor. If you're thinking of making an acquisition, if you think making an acquisition in the UK is difficult, the degree of difficulty increases to the level of an Olympic high diver. Europe, 5.9. North America, 5.5. Asia Pacific, 5.8. The rest of the world, 6+. 5 words for you: country, risk, currency, tax, culture. Approach these acquisitions with great caution, and remember, even gold medalists like Greg Louganis, they bang their head on the board. Here are the 7 laws. You can see I'm not a lawyer. I should like to thank Terry for this opportunity to speak to you, and I hope you found this presentation useful. I look forward to receiving your bids for Triplex Lloyd, but I would caution you that use of any of the strategy or tactics you've learned today will result in a severe setback to your earnings per share growth. For you will have infringed Pete's and my copyright and be liable to inordinate damages. Finally, Terry, that there is a present under here for Roger Dickens, that there's a Michael Knighton Manchester United shirt for him. That's for all the dribbling he does. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.